Saab340A Limitations.
Types of operations authorized: day and night VFR, IFR, icing conditions.
Next, limitations.
Required flight crew, pilot, and co-pilot.
Next, limitations.
Pressure altitude limitations, maximum operating, 25,000. Takeoff, -1,000 and +8,000.
Next, limitations.
Maneuvering load limits. Flaps retracted, -1 g, 2, +2.7 g. Flaps extended, 0 g, 2, +2.0 g.
Next, limitations.
Flap operating speeds. 0 degrees, takeoff, holding, VMO. 7 degrees, go around, 175 knots. 15 degrees, takeoff, approach, 175 knots. 20 degrees, approach, landing, 165 knots. 35 degrees, landing, 140 knots.
Operating condition and operating limits. Takeoff power, torque, 108%, ITT, 930 degrees Celsius, NG, 100.6 RPM, NP, 1396 RPM. Maximum continuous torque, 100%, ITT, 917 degrees Celsius, NG, 100 RPM, NP, 1396 RPM. Transient except for takeoff, torque, 118%, ITT, 960 degrees Celsius, NG, 105 RPM, NP, 1573 RPM. Engine start, ITT, 960 degrees Celsius. Between ground idle and flight idle with the propeller unfeathered, NP, minimum 950 RPM. Next, limitations.
Landing gear operating speeds. Retraction, VLOR, 150 knots. Extension, VLOE, 200 knots. Extended, VLE, 200 knots. Emergency extension, VLOE, 200 knots.
Next, limitations.
Minimum control speeds. VM, C, G, and VM, C, A, see performance data. VM, C, L, flaps, 20 degrees or 35 degrees, 106 knots.
Next, limitations.
Maximum operating speed, VMO, up to 16,000 feet, 250 knots. Above 16,000 feet, VMO, decreases linearly to 210 knots. Maneuvering speed, VA, 180 knots. Rough air penetration speed, VRA, up to 21,000 feet, 190 knots. Above 21,000 feet, VMO, -30 knots.
Operating condition and operating limits. Takeoff power, torque, 108%, ITT, 930 degrees Celsius, NG, 100.6 RPM, NP, 1396 RPM. Maximum continuous torque, 100%, ITT, 917 degrees Celsius, NG, 100 RPM, NP, 1396 RPM. Transient except for takeoff, torque, 118%, ITT, 960 degrees Celsius, NG, 105 RPM, NP, 1573 RPM. Engine start, ITT, 960 degrees Celsius. Between ground idle and flight idle with the propeller unfeathered, NP, minimum 950 RPM. Next, limitations.
Climb speeds. Clean airframe, VCL, +5. With airframe ice, VCL, CL plus 15.
Next, limitations.
Weight and balance. Structural weight limitations, pounds. Ramp, 28,800. Takeoff, 28,500. Landing, 27,200. Zero fuel, 25,700. Cargo 1 max, 1,150. Cargo 2 max, 850.
Next, limitations.
Center of gravity, limitations. See operator's weight and balance procedures for determining CG.
Next, limitations.
Runway, limitations. Maximum runway slope. Takeoff, -2%, 2, plus 2%. Landing, -2%, 2, plus 1.5%.
Next, limitations.
Wind limitations. The maximum crosswind was derived from tests done on a dry runway. This value is not limiting. Max tailwind for takeoff or landing 10 knots. Max demonstrated crosswind 35 knots.
Next, limitations.
Contaminated runway operations. See aircraft performance data for limitations.
Next, limitations.
Configuration deviation list. C, D, L. When operations are conducted, secondary airframe and engine parts missing, the aircraft must be operated in accordance with the basic aircraft limitations, and as amended by the C, D, L.
Next, limitations.
Miscellaneous limitations. Tire operation speed, 165 knots. Ditching is authorized if ditching dam is installed.
Next, limitations.
Air conditioning. Operation of recirc fan is authorized only when the respective bleed valve is open. The exception to this is takeoff and initial climb, where the bleed valves are closed for a short time, or if ground air card is connected.
Next, limitations.
Pressurization. Max cabin differential pressure, 7.5 psi. Auto mode, max pressure differential, 7.1 psi.
Next, limitations.
Batteries. Maximum main battery, temperature for takeoff, plus 64 degrees Celsius. Maximum battery, temperature for cross-gen start, plus 680 degrees Celsius. Maximum battery, temperature for battery start, plus 57 degrees Celsius. Minimum battery, temperature for battery start, minus 20 degrees Celsius. Minimum battery, temperature for battery start, minus 35 degrees Celsius. Minimum emergency, battery temperature for takeoff, serial number 358 and earlier, minus 18 degrees Celsius.
Operating condition and operating limits. Takeoff power, torque, 108%, ITT, 930 degrees Celsius, NG, 100.6 RPM, NP, 1396 RPM. Maximum continuous, torque, 100%, ITT, 917 degrees Celsius, NG, 100 RPM, NP, 1396 RPM. Transient except for takeoff, torque, 118%, ITT, 960 degrees Celsius, NG, 105 RPM, NP, 1573 RPM. Engine start, ITT, 960 degrees Celsius. Between ground idle and flight idle with the propeller unfeathered, NP, minimum 950 RPM. Next, limitations.
DC, generators. Maximum load, 5 minutes, limit, 600 amps. Maximum load, continuous, 400 amps. Normal voltage range, 27.5 to 29 volts DC.
Next, limitations.
External power. Minimum GPU, load capability for engine start, 1400 to 1600 amps. Nominal voltage range, 28 to 29.5 volts DC.
Next, limitations.
Power plant. Moving the power levers below flight idle, when airborne, is prohibited.
Next, limitations.
Engine type, General Electric, CT5A2. Propeller type, Dowty-Rotal, composite 4-blade.
Next, limitations.
Engine starting, limitations. Starter, duty cycle, 2 starter engagements, with 3 minutes cooling between each, then 25 minutes cooling before additional starter engagements. For dry motoring, 3 30-second starter engagements with 3 minutes cooling between each, then 60 minutes cooling before additional starter engagements. Maximum 10 seconds between selecting fuel on and ITT rise. Start attempt, maximum 70 seconds starter engagement. Dry motoring, maximum 30 seconds starter engagement.
Next, limitations.
Oil system. Approved oil types for engine and gearbox. Type 1 oils, Exxon Turbo Oil, 2389, or Castrol, 325. Type 2 oils, Aero, Shell, Turbine Oil, 500, Castrol, 205, Exxon Turbo Oil, 2380. Mobile Jet, Stauffer Jet 2. With Type 2 oil, minimum oil temperature for engine start is minus 40 degrees Celsius.
Next, limitations.
Engine oil system. Pressure, 30 to 100 psi. Maximum, 200 psi, after start for extremely cold oil. Minimum, 20 psi, ground idle operations. Temperature, 35 to 122 degrees Celsius. Maximum, 132 degrees Celsius, for 15 minutes.
Operating condition and operating limits. Takeoff power, torque, 108%, ITT, 930 degrees Celsius, NG, 100.6 RPM, NP, 1396 RPM. Maximum continuous, torque, 100%, ITT, 917 degrees Celsius, NG, 100 RPM, NP, 1396 RPM. Transient except for takeoff, torque, 118%, ITT, 960 degrees Celsius, NG, 105 RPM, NP, 1573 RPM. Engine start, ITT, 960 degrees Celsius. Between ground idle and flight idle with the propeller unfeathered, NP, minimum 950 RPM. Next, limitations.
Propeller oil system. Pressure, 25 to 140 psi. Ground idle operations only at 5 to 25 and 140 to 225 psi. Temperature, 45 to 77 degrees Celsius. Minimum, plus 25 degrees Celsius for ground operations and 15 minutes after takeoff. Maximum, plus 93 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes.
Next, limitations.
Fuel. The following fuel types are authorized for use: Jet A, Jet A1, JP5, Jet B, JP4. Takeoff is not authorized with the fuel temperature low light illuminated. Takeoff and landing, under normal operations, is prohibited with the crossfeed switch on, or Connecticut valve switch open. Usable fuel, 5,690 pounds. 200 pounds is the maximum fuel imbalance, all flight conditions.
Next, limitations.
Fuel temperatures. Jet A, Jet A1, JP5, minus 40 degrees Celsius, 2, plus 43 degrees Celsius. Jet B, JP4, minus 40 degrees Celsius, 2, plus 18 degrees Celsius.
Next, limitations.
Oxygen pressure requirements. Maximum, 1850 psi. Minimum, crew only, for smoke protection, 800 psi. Refer to oxygen tables for more detail.
Next, limitations.
Ice and rain protection. Definition: engine icing conditions exist any time that visible moisture is present, and outside air temperature is plus 10 degrees Celsius, or colder. Examples include clouds, rain, fog, with 1 mile or less visibility, snow, except hard pack, sleet, or standing water.
Next, limitations.
Engine anti-ice. Engine anti-ice must be selected on prior to entering icing conditions, and must remain on for 5 minutes after exiting icing conditions. Both AC generators must be operational for flight in icing conditions. Functional check of the auto ignition system must be accomplished each flight.
Next, limitations.
De-ice boots. Auto cycling switch must be selected to content flight at the first indication of ice accumulating on the aircraft. Auto cycling switch may be selected to one cycle as needed in flight for shedding ice or if cont mode is inoperative. Auto cycling switch must be selected off for takeoff and landing.
Next, limitations.
Propeller de-ice. Select normal mode with visible ice on aircraft at outside air temperature of -5 to -12 degrees Celsius. Select maximum mode with visible ice on aircraft at outside air temperature of -13 degrees Celsius or colder.
Next, limitations.
Autopilot. Operation in heading, HDG mode, at airspeeds below 1.3 VSO, is not authorized. During flight in icing conditions, AP, FD, IAS mode is the only vertical mode authorized for use during climb if ice accumulation is observed, or if it is uncertain if ice has accumulated. VS mode may be used, however, to transition to a new climb speed. During autopilot operation, the pilot must be seated at the controls with seat belt fastened. Autopilot use is prohibited below 200 feet above the field elevation during takeoff or go-around.
Next, limitations.
Yaw damper. Yaw damper operation is not authorized for takeoff or landing.
Next, limitations.
Minimum altitudes for autopilot use, Pan Am. Initial climb, 500 feet AGL. Non-precision approaches, MDA. Precision approaches, DH or DA. Visual approaches, 500 feet AGL. Use of the flight director in go-around mode during takeoff is not authorized.
Operating condition and operating limits. Takeoff power, torque, 108%, ITT, 930 degrees Celsius, NG, 100.6 RPM, NP, 1396 RPM. Maximum continuous torque, 100%, ITT, 917 degrees Celsius, NG, 100 RPM, NP, 1396 RPM. Transient except for takeoff, torque, 118%, ITT, 960 degrees Celsius, NG, 105 RPM, NP, 1573 RPM. Engine start, ITT, 960 degrees Celsius. Between ground idle and flight idle with the propeller unfeathered, NP, minimum 950 RPM.